Hello, Chuck Barlow, high school Sunday school teacher, Crossgates United Methodist Church, Brandon, Mississippi. This is Pandemic Sunday School lesson number 3, trying to catch up a little bit and get us to Easter. Talked last time a little bit about how Jesus uses the Old Testament and how important the Old Testament, the Hebrew Scriptures, are to him. So we want to talk today, because this is the run-up to Easter, about the idea of the blood of the Lamb. Something that you probably hear said in church every now and then. We sing some hymns that talk about the blood of the Lamb. Kind of a weird image for us, right? So what does that mean? Want to talk about, well, let me remind you, there is an introductory video. If you've not been in any of my classes before, you want to know a little bit about what this is or what we're doing, go back and watch the introductory video. And then again, I said this is lesson number 3. I forgot last time to talk about our ACT word of the day, high schoolers, junior theologians. So let's do this. ACT word of the day, because this is an important one for today, is context. Context. The circumstances, setting, background of an idea or a story that helps you understand its meaning. Okay? All of the things that go around a story to kind of provide a frame for the story, a background that helps you understand what's going on. Well, that's really what you need when you get into an image used in the Bible or biblical writings like the blood of the Lamb. Where does that come from, and what does it have to do with Easter? So let's start in the book of Exodus. We're going to start during the time of Moses. So in our little high production value simple timeline here, okay, start with Adam and Eve, go to Abraham, and then you go to Moses. If you want to put a date on Moses, and of course, like I said, scholars always argue about the dates, but you could think of Moses living around 1,200 years before Christ, and then David being about 200 years after that. And then, way down here is Jesus. Yep. So this is what we're talking about today, right? We're talking about Moses. And probably most of the story of Moses. The people of Israel were slaves in Egypt. They had come to Egypt during the time of Jacob and his son Joseph. And Joseph had started out as a slave in Egypt, had moved all the way up to being second in command. And when there was an extreme drought in this whole part of the world, to make a very long story short, Joseph moved Jacob, his father, and their whole family, their whole big clan, down to Egypt. And that worked really well for a while until there was a regime change in Egypt. There arose a pharaoh who knew not Joseph, is what Exodus tells us. And all of a sudden, the new pharaoh looked around and saw all of these Hebrews. They weren't Egyptians, didn't look like Egyptians, didn't worship like Egyptians. And he said, who are these people? And they kind of scare me, because there were a lot of them, the Bible tells us. And if you look at the geography of it, actually, the place where we believe the Hebrews had been settled in Egypt was basically on the eastern border of Egypt. And if someone were to invade Egypt from another country, coming from the east, they would probably have tracked that direction. They'd have probably moved through that part of the country, that part of Egypt where the Hebrews lived. So the new Pharaoh was probably afraid, and he was afraid, the Bible tells us, that if an invader came, that the Hebrews may team up with the invader instead of fighting to protect the Egyptians. So that was the situation now. The people of God, the Hebrews, the Israelites, were in Egypt. They were slaves. That lasted for several generations, about 400 years in Bible years. Note the 4 there, the 400 probably meaning it was a long, long time, right? The time came when God said, okay, enough's enough. I'm going to bring my people back out of Egypt and take them home, lead them back to Israel. So God comes to Moses and tells Moses, you're going to go and lead the people out of Egypt back home to Israel. Moses was reluctant. He didn't think he was the right person to do it. But over a series of chapters in Exodus, we see how God leads Moses and his brother Aaron to go to Pharaoh and ask Pharaoh, the Egyptian king, to let the people go. Pharaoh is not going to do this, doesn't want to do this, and God sends a series of plagues, bad things that happen to the Egyptians to show God's power and to try to get Pharaoh to let them go. I'm skipping a lot of stuff, right? But trying to keep these videos kind of short. The last plague is the plague of the angel of death. So God tells Moses, and then Moses tells Pharaoh, all right, enough's enough. We've had it. Here's what God's going to do. He's going to send the angel of death, and every firstborn child in the household of the household of the Egyptians, but of every household in Egypt, the firstborn child is going to die this night. Let me just read it to you. This is, and if you want to stop the video and read it yourself, let me tell you what I'm reading. I'm going to read Exodus chapter 11, verses 1 through 7. 11, 1 through 7. And then I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to read Exodus 12, 1 through 13, and 21 through 32. Exodus 12, 1 through 13, and 21 through 32. So if you want to stop the video, read that for yourself, and then come back and I'll go over it. Okay. Now the Lord said to Moses, one more plague I will bring on Pharaoh and on Egypt. After that, he will let you go from here. When he lets you go, he will surely drive you out from here completely. Speak now in the hearing of the people that each man ask from his neighbor and each woman from her neighbor for articles of silver and articles of gold. The Lord gave the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians. Furthermore, the man Moses himself was greatly esteemed in the land of Egypt, both in the sight of Pharaoh's servants and in the sight of the people. Moses said, now this is Moses going into Pharaoh and saying, Moses said, thus says the Lord, about midnight I am going out into the midst of Egypt, and all the firstborn in the land of Egypt shall die, from the firstborn of the Pharaoh who sits on his throne, even to the firstborn of the slave girl who is behind the millstones, all the firstborn of the cattle as well. Moreover, there shall be a great cry in all the land of Egypt, such as there has not been before, and such as shall never be again. But against any one of the sons of Israel, a dog will not even bark, whether against man or beast, that you may understand how the Lord makes a distinction between Egypt and Israel. So, well, God says that the Israelites aren't going to have to suffer this fate, that their firstborn will not be visited by the angel of death or the destroyer. So how is that going to happen? Okay, now we move into Exodus chapter 12. Now the Lord said to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, this month shall be the beginning of months for you. It is to be the first month of the year to you. This is like a new beginning. This is when you're coming out of slavery to go back to the promised land, to go back to Canaan, Palestine, Israel, and to kind of start over in your life between this people whom God had chosen and God himself. This is verse 3, 12:3. Speak to all the congregation of Israel, saying, on the 10th of this month, they are each one to take a lamb for themselves, according to their father's households, a lamb for each household. Now, if the household is too small for a lamb, then he and his neighbor nearest to his house are to take one according to the number of persons in them, according to what each man should eat. You are to divide the lamb. Your lamb shall be an unblemished male, a year old. You may take it from the sheep or from the goats. You shall keep it until the 14th day of the same month. Then the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel is to kill it at twilight. They shall eat the flesh that same night, roasted with fire, and they shall eat it with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. Now, again, I'm skipping a lot here. But the story goes on, and if you look at let's look at verse 21. So this is chapter 12, verse 21. Then Moses called for all the elders of Israel and said to them, "Go and take yourself lambs according to your families and slay the Passover lamb." Okay, because this was Passover. It becomes known as Passover because the angel of death that was going to visit the Egyptian families was going to pass over the homes of the Israelites and not enter in. So this is what becomes known as Passover. The Jewish people today still observe Passover. This is Passover week for the Jewish people. It aligns on the calendars with Easter. You shall take a bunch of hyssop. This is verse 22. You shall take a bunch of hyssop and dip it in the blood which is in the basin, the blood of the lamb that they've just slain, and apply some of the blood that is in the basin to the lintel and the 2 doorposts, and none of you shall go outside the door of the house until morning. So they're to take the blood of the lamb that they have slain as the sacrifice and that they're going to cook and eat for their Passover meal, put it over the lintel, the top part, and the doorposts of their home. And that's going to be the sign for the angel of death, the angel of God, the destroyer, it's called various things, to pass over this house and to not enter in. Okay, and that's exactly what happens. And that night, around midnight, there arises a great cry in Egypt because the parents basically all work and wake up and they find their firstborn dead, the people and even of the cattle. And this is the straw that breaks the camel's back for Pharaoh. Pharaoh then says, "Okay, please, yes, go. You go, take your children, take your wives, take your flocks, everything, just please go." And interestingly, he says, "And bless me as you go." Now we know that Pharaoh, a little bit later, changes his mind, sends his army after Moses, and that's the whole story about the crossing of the Red Sea. But today, let's click over into the gospel story, and let's look at Luke. And this is Luke, and I'm just going to start at Luke 22, verse 1. Okay, Luke chapter 22, verse 1. And this is when Jesus was in Jerusalem, and this is what we would think of as Holy Week. This is Jesus' last week. This is working. These are the days prior to Jesus' crucifixion. Okay, and guess what? It was Passover week. So all the Jewish people there in Jerusalem, where they were celebrating Passover. What were they thinking about? A lamb that had been slain, putting blood over the lintels and the doorposts, which they still did as part of their Passover celebration. A lamb that had been slain to save them from death. And here's Jesus in Jerusalem, and what's he going to do for us? It's basically the same thing, right? He becomes the lamb. His blood becomes the blood of the lamb. And no, we don't take it and smear it over the doorpost, but what do? Every Lord's Supper, right? We take his body, the wafer, the bread, that has been broken for us, like the lamb was sacrificed for the people. We take his blood, which has been shed for us. Now, in the Protestant tradition, in our tradition, the bread's just bread, and the wine or the grape juice is just grape juice, right? But it means different things to some different denominations and different churches. To us, it's symbolic, but it's deeply symbolic and meaningful that he was the lamb that was slain, and his blood is what saves us from death. Now, for the Hebrews back in Exodus, they were thinking of physical death. For us, we think of spiritual death, right? He's saving our souls. He's saving the part of us that God has made to live with him eternally if we'll just go along with God's plan. So Luke chapter 22, and look where it is. Now, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which is called the Passover, was approaching. The chief priests and the scribes were seeking how they might put him to death, for they were afraid of the people. And if you go down to verse 7, then came the first day of unleavened bread, on which the Passover lamb had to be sacrificed. And Jesus said to Peter and John, saying, "Go and prepare the Passover for us, so that we may eat it." And this becomes what we call the Last Supper. It is they're Jewish people. They're Jews. They're in Jerusalem, and steeped in the context, ACT word of the day, of the Old Testament, of the Hebrew Scriptures as they were, and as we should be. They were celebrating a Passover meal, a Seder, the Hebrew term for it. And Jesus, during that meal and during the crucifixion and the things to come, what we now celebrate as the Lord's Supper, he becomes the blood of the Lamb. He becomes the Lamb. He takes the place for us from that physical lamb that was slain during Exodus and all those years as the Hebrew people celebrated Passover. He steps into the shoes, so to speak, of that Passover lamb. He becomes the lamb. His body is broken for us. His blood is shed for us. And that's why we sing about the blood of the Lamb. There is power, 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 power in the blood of the Lamb, an old gospel song says. That's the way we see Jesus. He is our Lamb, the Lamb of the New Covenant, the Lamb of the New Testament church. Have a wonderful Easter. Love you all. Wash your hands. Walk your dog. Take care of yourself, and we'll get through all of this together. I'm really missing teaching people instead of a computer screen. See you later. Thanks.